What a great way to get started. I want to thank all of you for joining. Let me just, I'm going to put everyone on mute for just a little bit. Actually, if I'm being honest, you're going to be on mute for a very long time, except for our author. I want to say hello. I know, I'm looking at, I know all of you, many of you. Rabbi Aaron Miller, I'm one of the rabbis at Washington Hebrew. I'm so grateful to the Jewish Book Council for making this morning's conversation possible. At some point in our conversation, I'll be posting a link to the book. If you are so inspired to dive more deeply into this fascinating story, there's a way to get the book for yourselves. If we were doing this in person, obviously there'd be a way to get the book right afterwards, but this is going to be our virtual way to do it. Just by way of housekeeping, you are all muted at the moment. Aside from our author, I'm going to encourage you to stay muted as our conversation progresses. At the end of our conversation, probably about 50 minutes into our conversation, or after I ask a few questions, I'll ask anyone who has questions of their own to unmute themselves to ask and then to remute. If you have any questions that come up until then, that you want to just write down somewhere, you'll be able to message me directly with those questions, and I can frame them if you'd like me to ask on your behalf at the end of our time together. All that said, I am delighted to welcome our guest today, Dr. Katherine Fennelly, who has encouraged me to refer to her as Katherine, not Dr. Fennelly, who is joining us this morning from Brooklyn. She's going to share more on her book, Family Declassified, which is a fascinating story of her real self-discovery into her family's narrative as an adult. Katherine Fennelly has a PhD from Columbia University and is known for her research on immigration and health. After discovering her Jewish roots as an adult, she began studying her own family ancestry. When not tracking down classified documents, Katherine volunteers for refugee-serving organizations and enjoys biking in Prospect Park and spending time with her daughters and granddaughters in Brooklyn, New York. Katherine, thank you so much for joining today. It's an honor to have you here to share your family story with us. I'm going to turn things over to our author for this morning, and I will do my best to, to spotlight her. I am going to go on mute, and again, I'm going to encourage everyone to stay on mute as our conversation moves forward. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to any comments and questions you may have at the end. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some slides that will just keep me on track and show some photographs and a few things that may be of interest. So let me do that. Okay. So this is the full title of the book, Family Declassified, Uncovering My Grandfather's Journey from Spy to Children's Book Author. And this is a photo of the cover of the book. It's available from a local bookstore and from the publisher Sunbury Press. It's also available on Amazon, and there's a Kindle version. There's a Nook version, Barnes & Noble. There's going to be an audio version, which I have not heard yet, and it should be available soon, but not yet. So what I'm going to cover today is why I wrote this book, what were my sources, how did I do it, a touch of findings, and some focus on secrets and enigmas. This is a watercolor of my grandfather at the end of his life. His name was Ferenc, Francis in Hungarian, Kalnay, and we all called him Ferko. I am a very unlikely biographer of my grandfather. Had you told me when I was growing up that I would have written a book about him, I would have been incredulous, because he was living in Mexico the whole time that I was in my childhood, and my mother was estranged from him. I'll mention that a little bit later. He abandoned the family in Hungary right after, during the Depression, and he had girlfriends in every port and so forth. So she rarely talked about him. But what I did know was that he was a best-selling children's book author. And while he was in Mexico for 20 years, actually, he wrote some children's books. This one won a Newbery medal, and we had copies of his books, so I knew that. And we would get presents at Christmas time. He would send a box of Mexican marionettes and embroidered blouses and so forth. And that was a lot of what I knew about him. But then in 2015, I got a letter from a researcher in Austria who told me he was writing a book about my grandfather's time as a spy in World War II, and could I give him some information? So that surprised me. And then a few years later, one of my daughters gave me 23andMe, and I learned that on my mother's side, my grandfather, maternal grandfather's side, I'm 98.4% Ashkenazi. So that really surprised me because I grew up in an entirely secular household. We never went to religious services. We didn't discuss religion. And of course, that meant that on my mother's side, there wasn't a Jewish uncle in the family tree. It meant that my mother's parents, her grandparents, her cousins, her aunts and uncles, everyone was Jewish. And that, plus the discovery that my grandfather was a spy, is what led me to undertake some research into his story. So how did I do it? Well, I spent 5 years doing the research. I started with family members who had known my grandfather when he was alive. I'm going to talk a little bit more about government documents that I explored. And I'm an academic, and I just love being in a library and doing research. I spent many, many hours doing that, reading and reading, going to genealogical sites, newspaper archives. The Jewish research sites are wonderful, and many of you, I'm sure, know this. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has an invaluable website. I tell people, even if they are not Jewish, that there are all kinds of, there's all kinds of good information. For example, in Jewish Gen, if you subscribe to the Jewish Gen newsletter, every day they'll send a summary of items about genealogy that are extremely useful. I also used History Hub. I'll mention that briefly, how one uses that for genealogical research. I joined maybe 40 Facebook groups because there's a Facebook group for everything. There are Facebook groups for Hungarian food and Hungarian Jewish ancestry and Jewish genealogy and so on. And I was able to post questions there. I was also I've been able to tell people about the book on some of those sites. And then I corresponded with experts, and I found them to be uniformly generous with their responses and time. I learned about things like onomastics, which I knew nothing about before. That's the study of surnames. And actually for Jews, that's an extremely important field of study, and one that's fascinating. When did Jews acquire surnames historically? Why did they change them? And for Hungarians, there were quite a few name changes. I studied, or I corresponded with people about psychiatric hospitals. I'll mention that very briefly, with military historians, specialists in the wars, both the First and Second World War, and sources in Mexico. This is a photo of a card that I got because as the relative of someone who was in the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA, I was able to join the OSS Society, and they have a social platform on which one can post questions, and that has been useful. I spent 3 days in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and of the 13 billion pages of paper held today, the National Archives have digitized about 500 million. So there are many that are still not digitized, and it's worthwhile going down in person. And I've been very, very sorry to learn that our new president has fired the head of the National Archives. The budget is likely to be greatly reduced at a time when actually it needs to be increased, because the presidential library papers from previous presidents are enormous and they need to be digitized. And so rather than continuing to gather information on our history, we're going to have to cut back. So when one goes to the National Archives, if the documents are not digitized, as most of the ones I was looking at were not, then you get these tissue paper original copies. And I went through my grandfather's records from his time in the OSS. This is, you don't need to read any of this, but it just shows you that they have what they call record groups for different categories of documents. And this is an example of a list of record groups. And I had circled one that I was interested in particular, records relating to the survey of foreign experts, which is one that something my grandfather directed at one point. And then you fill out a poll slip like, old-fashioned slips that we used to use, if you remember in libraries, well, we would fill those out. And the archivists pull out the paper documents, put them on correls, and bring them to you in a very nice reading room. And fortunately, you're able to take photographs. I took photos with my cell phone and was able to bring back these hundreds and hundreds of documents that way. So I used a social media, excuse me, a software program called Scrivener, which is more popular in Europe than it is in the United States, but it's very useful if you're writing a manuscript or a book along a thesis and so forth. And it's used for organizing writing projects, and you can move around text and much better and much more easily than one could using, for example, Microsoft Word. In the beginning, I was trying that. I was going crazy. So with Scrivener, I have a document like one this is actually a screenshot of my Scrivener, one of my Scrivener pages. And on the left, you see all these categories that I had created of how I was organizing documents. In the middle, you see a particular document. And then they have something cool, which is you can write a synopsis of the piece of the document that you want to manipulate and remember. And you can sort it like old-fashioned 3x5 cards, which I used when I was writing my thesis. I actually used McBee sort cards and had them on physical cards. It's a lot easier to do it this way. And you can sort these cards and it will sort your chapters and your headings for you. So that's a nice way to organize. And then you can later compile all of your documents, or rather all of your notes, your research notes, into a manuscript. Excuse me. History Hub is a crowdsourced platform that the National Archives sponsors, and it has both citizen archivists and also paid archivists who will answer questions. And so if you are trying to learn about a family member, you can just register free for History Hub and post your question. And here's an example. I had a question about some code names that I discovered in some of the documents I was looking at. And I sent them this question. I said, I've read a copy of a memo from James R. Murphy, the head of counterintelligence in a particular branch of the OSS during World War II. And it was from someone who was called Puritan. And in the memo, Puritan refers to jester. Can anyone help me identify these two individuals? And they sent me this long response with documents that used those names. So it's just a very useful way. Or you can send them a question saying, my grandmother was born in 1898 and she came to the port of New York, and I'm trying to find out when she became a citizen, and they'll answer questions for you. So who was my grandfather? Who was Francis Kalnay? Well, he was born in what was at the time the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the very turn of the previous century. And as I say, he was called Ferenc Kalnay. His mother was Rosa Marguerite Kalnay. And here's a picture of her with actually a baby or a slightly older brother of my grandfather's when she was young. But I did a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI and to the CIA for my grandfather's personnel records. And what I discovered is that although my grandfather had, and his brothers, his older brothers, had said that his mother died when he was 1 year old, that in fact, that was not true at all. Both of the siblings said she died in 1900 when Ferko was 1 year old. But what I learned was that from a second cousin that she didn't die. She was put into a psychiatric institute and she was there for almost 2 decades. And I later confirmed that she didn't die until 1944, the year that Hitler invaded Hungary, rather than having died in 1900. This is a photo of the psychiatric hospital where I believe she was interned for many, many years. Beautiful place, but I mean, being locked up in a hospital like this, you can only imagine what it would be like. Then my great-grandfather, Joseph Kalnay, took a mistress, Erzsébet Svengali. You can see from the cross that she was a Catholic. She was a Christian. And I don't know if they ever married. I rather doubt that he was able to divorce my grandmother. But in any case, my grandfather and his brothers said that she was his mother, and she was his stepmother. When he was 15, my grandfather was studying in a maritime academy in what is now Croatia. And so he had a very difficult childhood. He was living with a stepmother whom actually none of the children liked very much. Then he was sent out of Budapest. He lived in other places. Then when he was 15, he was in this maritime school. This is a picture of my grandfather. He was the youngest of four young men. So these are his three older brothers. This, of course, is his father. And this may be the last time they were all together. They're wearing World War I uniforms because they all served in the Imperial Army for the Empire during World War I. And then in 1919, my grandfather took a Hungarian ship. He was in the Imperial Merchant Marines, and that's how he got to the United States. And it was just before a very major crackdown on immigration, 1924, but even just a year after he was there, after he landed. So he was able to enter on a seaman's visa and later naturalize with no problem whatsoever to become a US citizen. When he was 20, he married my maternal grandmother, Erzsébet Radkai. We called her Elsie. You can see she was rather a femme fatale. They had a stormy marriage. They spent a lot of time in Argentina because my grandfather's two older brothers were unable to get into the US the year after he did, and they were diverted to Buenos Aires, where they stayed and settled. And so I have a lot of Argentine relatives, and my mother was born in Argentina because my grandfather, my grandmother, and my mother and her sister went back and forth to Hungary, Argentina, and the US. The first place my grandfather went was to New Brunswick, New Jersey. And I was very amused and surprised to learn that New Brunswick at the time, in the 1900s and 1920s and the early 30s, was the Hungarian capital of the United States. And that people in Hungary dreamed of coming to New Brunswick. Johnson & Johnson was an employer there. You had to speak Hungarian to become a supervisor at J&J. Because there were so many Hungarians. There were Hungarian newspapers there and so forth. And then my grandfather began to spend a lot of time in New York City and particularly in Greenwich Village. And he joined a coterie of leftists and artists and writers there with many Hungarian connections. And I write about this in the book, and it's actually a fascinating history. And I write some more about New Brunswick. New Brunswick still has a Hungarian population, and they're having a Hungarian Heritage Festival. It's a virtual festival, and it's in June. It's in March, and then they have another festival or another celebration in June. But if you happen to have Hungarian ancestry or know people who do, you can just Google Hungarian Heritage Expo, and you'll get information. I'm giving a virtual talk. It's quite similar to the one I'm giving today, so you may not need to hear it again, but they have lots of other talks that are going to be part of that. Some of my grandfather's Hungarian friends were artists, and these are some New Yorker covers that were designed by Ilonka Karas, who was one of those friends. And her husband, William Nyland, was a Dutch chemist who was the leader of the Gurdjieff movement. Gurdjieff was an Greek-Armenian mystic who was very popular and actually still has many devotees in the United States, well, all over the world. He had, Ilonka's husband, Willem, had a cabin in Brewster, New York, and my grandfather settled in Brewster. Julian Demiski was also there. He was another Hungarian, and he designed 62 covers for the New Yorker magazine and exhibited paintings at MoMA and the Guggenheim. And he was a leftist, as my grandfather was at the time, who designed cartoons for The Liberator, the communist magazine in the United States. This is a cover that Julian, my grandfather's business partner later and close friend, designed for The Liberator. And you can see that the lead article was The Wisdom of Lenin in that particular issue. So he was, as I say, a member of a group of leftists, and I'll write about that in the book and don't have time to tell you much more about it right now. But Demiski and my grandfather bought a camp in Brewster, New York, and they had a nudist colony for artists there with many famous artists. One of the few things my mother ever said about my grandfather and her childhood was how totally embarrassed she was that they had a nudist camp on the property. So you can learn more about that in the book. Some of the people who came to that camp, Camp Artemis, Max Eastman, you may know of his name. He was another famous leftist in the United States who edited The Masses, which became The Liberator. His third wife was Yvette Sekele, a Hungarian, who was Theodore Dreiser's lover. When she was, and she met Dreiser at Ferko and Julian Demiski's camp in Brewster when she was 15 and he was in his 40s. And then Max Eastman was an ardent proponent of women's rights and free love. So I imagine that's part of what attracted him to this site. So how did a Jewish Hungarian socialist immigrant become a high-level spy for the Allies in the United States? That's what began to intrigue me. I actually gave a paper on this topic last May at the Biennial Scholars Conference at the American Jewish Historical Society. It was held in New York. And I believe that the answer to this, after having looked at his papers, was because of his connection with something called the FLIS, the Foreign Language Information Service. It was later named the Common Council for American Unity. They published a journal, Common Cause, and it was created just at the time of the First World War to explain the United States' role in the war to immigrants and to foster their support and patriotism. So my grandfather worked for almost 2 decades as an editorial advisor, not full-time, but off and on with the FLIS. And he prepared newspaper releases from the US government for foreign language newspapers. And he translated and interpreted editorials, probably particularly in Hungarian. My grandfather spoke 7 languages, but later English and Spanish and Hungarian were his primary languages, but he also spoke Serbo-Croatian and German and Italian and so on. And then he would gather editorials from these foreign language newspapers that were available in the US and give them to the government. At the time, he was also going back and forth to Argentina because, as I mentioned, his 2 older brothers were there. They became very prominent architects there. And if you mention the names Andres and Jorge Kalnay in Buenos Aires, people today know of them as prominent architects. They are no longer alive, but they designed many buildings there. So in 1941, the United States joined World War II after Pearl Harbor, of course. And 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor is when my grandfather began working with what was first called the Coordinator of Information Office in an oral intelligence section. And that was the precursor to the OSS. This is a picture of William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, who was the director of the OSS and later prominent in the as a director in the CIA. When my grandfather was working for oral intelligence, I think he used his work that he had done in journalism. I didn't mention a lot of that, but his FLIS experience working with foreign presses and the US press and so forth, and his extensive knowledge of European immigrants and connections, I should say, with the European immigrant community to interview newly arrived refugees and representatives of cultural organizations. And so the Navy would give ship manifests to my grandfather and to an organization that he created then in oral intelligence so that they could select people to interview. And if you think about it, before the internet age, newly arrived immigrants from fascist occupied Europe, interviewing them was, of course, a very effective way of gathering intelligence about what was going on. So let's say you were working in the perfume industry in Vichy-occupied France. Well, you would likely know about chemicals and how they were transported, where they were produced. You would know about where the Germans had set up their particular installations and so forth. And so they would interview arriving immigrants, they would then determine which of them might be particularly amenable to themselves reporting, perhaps going back to fascist occupied Europe and spying and giving intelligence to the government. And that is what was then called the Survey of Foreign Experts, this database that cataloged human and tangible assets in Europe and beyond. And my grandfather became the director of that survey in 1943. This is a picture of Ferko in his OSS uniform, and he worked for the OSS for the exact span of the war, 1941, of the US involvement in the war, 1941 to 1945. And then in 1944, he was involved in a very highly classified unit of the OSS. And this was a top secret branch. Some of those files are still classified and some were destroyed, but it was a branch that was tasked with obtaining strategic information, what was happening in fascist Europe. And at this point, it was by recruiting and training spies to go behind enemy lines. And my grandfather himself, I believe, went behind enemy lines. I have quite a bit on how that training was done. There was a camp in Maryland, fascinating to me, the way that of learning about how the US trained spies in World War II. This is a photo from a network that shows some of these spies. And then in the summer of 1944, my grandfather was named the head of X2 Balkans. And this whole time he was based in Europe, and particularly he was in London part of the time, but he was often in Bari, Italy, right across from Yugoslavia. And that's where the OSS had one of its important offices. And he was named head of X2 Balkans and was able to go to the Balkans and train people to go there from Bari. So one of the questions that I asked myself was, what was happening in Hungary in 1944 when my grandfather had a key role in the Allied war efforts in the region? Because at this point, I knew that my grandfather was Jewish and that the whole family was Jewish. So what was happening? Well, before I answer that question, I'd like to give a little bit of history. And you may know that Hungary, before World War I, had the second largest Jewish population in Europe after Poland, almost 1 million Jews in Hungary in 1910. It was part of what was considered a golden age for Hungarian Jews that began at the end of the 19th century, when Judaism was formally designated a, quote, received religion on a par with Christianity. Jews were intellectuals, they were artists, they were the most educated segment of Hungarian society. Many middle-class merchants and prominent Jewish business leaders, especially converts to Christianity. In World War II, Hitler invaded Hungary at the very end of the war, at the point when the Nazis were on the verge of collapse. Mussolini had collapsed, and when the world began to know of the atrocities as a final solution. And the reason that Hitler invaded at that point was to try to prevent Hungary from defecting from the Third Reich, as Italy and Finland and Bulgaria and Romania had done. Hungarian Jews did not believe, in spite of what they began to learn about the Nazi atrocities in Poland and other parts of Europe, they couldn't believe this would happen in civilized Hungary, where there had been this golden age. Hungarians, Jews were notoriously nationalistic. And yet Hungarian nationalism was becoming more and more Christianized. And you can tell from this poster of the time, could be a poster from today, given what's happening in Hungary today and elsewhere. Being Hungarian for Jews meant supporting the state and suppressing their Jewish identity. And then Budapest became transformed into what Tim Cole, who's at Bristol University, with whom I corresponded, has called Holocaust City. Because although, as I mentioned, the war was almost over when Hitler invaded in March of 1944, almost 600,000 Jews were murdered in Hungary in 12 months. Almost 75% of the Jewish population began in Greater Hungary, but then later, after Hitler invaded, it began in Budapest as well. And the reason that Hungary didn't defect from the Third Reich, although there were some who wanted to, was because a majority of Hungarians didn't want to defect. They regarded the Germans as allies against Bolshevism and against Slavs and Romanian neighbors with whom they had conflicts, and the Jews. And so they were welcomed throughout the country. Now, part of this goes back to World War I, where there was a treaty that ended the war called the Treaty of Trianon, in which Hungary lost almost half of her population, 3/4 of her territory, and access to the sea. So you can see this is what was left of Hungary after the Treaty of Trianon, when in fact Greater Hungary had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire with this enormous territory. So in World War II, there were still many landowners in Hungary and Christian business owners and the bourgeoisie who wanted to eliminate competition from Jews as part of that perceived, but not really actual competition. But they also were hoping that the Nazis would help to recover some of the lands that were lost after World War I. And in fact, Hitler did return some parts of what is now the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic at the time, and parts of Romania to Hungary, and that was enormously popular. Furthermore, there was, of course, the Depression from 1929 to 1941, and Jews were branded or were blamed as the cause of the Depression, many other places as well. And there were false stereotypes that were promoted of wealthy Jews, ignoring the fact that there were many middle-class bourgeois Jews as well. And this is a poster from the time, just saying Nazism, or excuse me, Bolshevism is equivalent to Judaism. The collusion of non-Jewish Hungarians, and this is something that just hit me like a hammer when I learned some of this. You may know that Adolf Eichmann was sent by Hitler to oversee the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz, principally to Auschwitz. And he was there they deported almost 500,000 Hungarian Jews between May 15th and July of 1944. In just those few months, Eichmann had only 100 staff and 20 officers with him for that deportation. So obviously, there was enormous collusion on the part of Hungarian citizens and the government. And then in October, Ferenc Szalasi was appointed the head of the Eurocross. That's the fascist government and the fascist party in Hungary. And at that point, that's when thousands of Jews were massacred. And this is a photograph of Jews who'd been just shot in the streets on the banks of the Danube. And if you've been to Budapest, you've seen perhaps this very, very moving memorial of bronzed shoes from Jews who were shot and thrown into the Danube. And the Western powers were also culpable in that they refused to lift immigration quotas, even as there was recognition of these terrible massacres. So coming back to that question, what happened to my grandfather's mother, his sister, his nephew, who remained in Budapest after the Nazi invasion? Well, you remember that picture of my great-grandmother Rosa with the baby when she was so young and youthful? This is a picture of her after she was released from the Psychiatric Institute, and she lived with Ferko's oldest sister, Borbala. People called her Borishka, and she was taking care of her. And then the March 19th invasion of Hitler or the German forces. By April, all Hungarian Jews were wearing yellow stars on their clothing, and 220,000 Jews in Budapest were forced to move into 2,000 yellow star houses to facilitate their deportation, and that included my family. Here's a picture of Jewish women and children being marched through the streets of Budapest in 1944. And here's a picture of a yellow star on an apartment building. Ironically, my great aunt and her mother, my grandmother Rosa, had Swedish Wallenberg's Swedish letters of protection called skyddspass that would have permitted them to leave. But Borishka's son, Dennis, was in a forced labor camp, as so many young men or almost all Jewish young men and men of middle age and older were. And she didn't want to leave Hungary while he was there. And I have to say that as a mother and a grandmother, I can understand that. This is a photograph, not of the particular camp where my Ferko's nephew was working, but a similar one, laying rails in the winter of 1945, where many were just died of cold. And so this is what happened. Ferko's sister Borishka, when she was 45 years old, was arrested, taken to the Aerocross headquarters, and beaten to death. And I have information on that from Yad Vashem. His mother died 1 month later of heart failure. Again, you can understand how that would happen. And Borishka's son, Dennis, was shot at the labor camp March 31st, 1945, 3 weeks before it was liberated by the Soviets. Okay, so who was Francis Kalnay? Well, he was a very accomplished member of the OSS, and I have quite a bit of, I think, proof in the book that his accomplishments were significant in the Allied success in World War II. Recruiting resistance fighters, training them, heading many sabotage and propaganda efforts in a number of countries, Yugoslavia, Serbia, Northern Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary. This is just one quote of many that I include, which is from one of the records I got at the archives. This is from the director, OSS director for psychological warfare, saying, Mr. K is doing currently one of the most intelligent organizational jobs in connection with his mission, which I have ever seen done in the annals of OSS. So he was a complicated man. He was a war hero. As I've mentioned, he was a flawed husband and a father. And after the war, he had many careers. He first had a farm on a vineyard in Ojai, California. He designed bread ovens and pans for baking bread. He fled to Mexico in 1953, and I write about this and about the McCarthy era in the United States and the fact that because my grandfather and the Allies in general were supporting Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia, who was a communist, but who was a strong anti-fascist and a partisan, in the 50s, any historical association with communists made you suspect. And so not my grandfather at that point had left the OSS. He left right out at the end of the war, 1945. But he had friends who were being arrested, and he had an assistant who was also his lover, actually, who was interrogated and then lost her job with what was then the CIA and lost her pension because of her association with him and his work with Tito. And I mentioned this. And then in Mexico, he wrote children's books. He wrote articles about cooking for House Beautiful, and he designed homes. He was in a beautiful town called Valle Bravo, which is southwest of Mexico City. This is one of 25 homes that he designed there. Beautiful places. These are pictures of the children's books he wrote while he was in Mexico. And this is one of some of his articles for House Beautiful magazine about cooking. This is 4 loaves of bread that my older daughter baked last week, actually, using one of Ferko's bread pans that he designed. He returned to the United States in 1974 when he was 75 years old to Carmel. He always lived in beautiful places. But during his life, he rarely discussed his time in the OSS, and he didn't reveal any details. He never spoke of the Holocaust in Hungary or the murders of his sister and his nephew. He only acknowledged that we were Jewish just before his death at age 93. Now, the OSS oath of office swore you to secrecy about your work there, so perhaps it's not surprising he didn't talk about that. And it could be a violation of the Espionage Act to reveal much of what you had done. And then hidden Jewish ancestry, as I'm sure you all know, is very common. These are just a few of some famous people who didn't learn that they were Jewish until they were adults and have written, in fact, about their what the impact was on them of learning it. In Hungary, the voices of survivors, Jewish survivors, were suppressed by the communist government, which stopped prosecuting war crimes soon after the communists took over. And there was a collective sense of guilt among Hungarians and the remedy prescribed for their pain was forgetting. So they would talk about how it was an anti-fascist war, but very little Hungarian acknowledgement of the role of Jews and the massacre of Jews. Some of the reasons, and I go into quite a bit of detail on family secrets and hidden ancestry in the book, and some of the reasons are, of course, that it's very common among victims of trauma. It's a mechanism for survival. It's a way of shielding children and future generations, and it's a response to continued anti-Semitism in so many places. The majority of the remaining Jews in Hungary lived in some form of silence, if not downright amnesia, about their identity and history. And I talk also, as I said, about family secrets. And then what's interesting is when a secret is shared with more than two people and across generations, breaking the secret becomes a taboo. And I've seen this in particular with my my Argentinian relatives who especially wanted to keep our Jewish ancestry hidden. Although I think that has changed now. I've been pushing back against that, and I think it's changing. My grandfather died on December 2nd, 1992, when he was 93 years old. This is the 48th anniversary of his sister's murder in Budapest. Now, these are a few of the other topics that I talk about in Family Declassified, anti-immigrant sentiments in the United States, more about my grandfather's early life and about the camp that I mentioned in his time with socialists and mystics, life in Argentina with his older brothers, psychiatric hospitals, bootlegging in New York during Prohibition, which is actually a side story that I couldn't resist putting in, had to do with my mother's stepfather. My grandfather's abandonment of his wives, his girlfriends, his details of his life as a spy. I have quite a bit of that. And anti-Semitism in the OSS and the US government, and then his work in Mexico. So I'm very briefly going to tell you just one word about my next project, which is in many ways a happier subject. And it's about, well, this part isn't happy, that the erasure of women artists in the Hungarian Holocaust, but my my great aunt Bordishka, I've told you, was murdered. But I learned that she was an accomplished artist in the 1930s before the war. And so I'm studying her as a case study and trying to learn why, in spite of the number of exhibitions she had and so forth, she was erased. And I've learned that that's a very common phenomenon for Jewish female artists in Central Europe after the war. This is a picture of me holding Borishka's, one of her paintings, the only one that I was able to. I ordered it online from a gallery in Budapest. I was so happy to get this. And now I'm going to read you just 2 minutes worth of an excerpt from the book, and then we'll entertain some questions. So, what accounts for the silence of my grandfather and my family regarding the deaths of their family members? After the Second World War, denial of the atrocities of the Holocaust and the erasure of Jewish identity were characteristic not only of the perpetrators, but also of the victims. And once I learned this, I came across story after story of hidden Jewish ancestry. In my grandfather's case, anti-Semitism in Hungary surely played a role in the suppression of our Jewish ancestry. And our family was also influenced by close ties to Christian Argentina, where Verko's brothers settled and where my mother was born. But even more than my grandfather's silence and that of our Argentine relatives, it's the silence of my mother and my grandmother that troubles me the most, because I knew them intimately. How much of our family history did my mother know beyond her Jewish ancestry? Did she discuss the past with her mother, Elsie? Did she ever reveal details to my father? Did she have nightmares about what would have happened to the family had she and Elsie and her sister Petty not fled Hungary in 1933? I will never know the answer to those questions, but I am saddened by my own lack of curiosity about our history until it was too late to talk to my mother or grandmother about their experiences. Before writing this book, if you had asked me what it meant to be half Hungarian, I would have given examples so superficial and positive, they might have been conjured by a director of tourism. I think of my grandmother Elsie's love of Hungarian music and how she would get up to dance the Czardas when we took her to Hungarian restaurants in New York to celebrate her birthday. I think of Ferko's soft Hungarian accent, cultivated and maintained after half a century, 3/4 of a century really, in North and South America. I think of my mother's delectable stuffed cabbage leaves and homemade pastries, and I remember her pleasure when a Yorkville shopkeeper said in Hungarian, "Keset chocolate," I kiss your hand, as she left his shop laden with cans of paprika, caraway seeds, and smoked sausages. Years later, when she was dying and could no longer communicate with us, my nephew memorized the phrase and was rewarded with delighted giggles each time he said it aloud. I understand now that these colorful images mask the horrors my family members lived through in the 1930s and 40s. And in fact, not a day goes by that I don't think about their fates and my own Hungarian heritage. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Um, I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to add myself to this conversation as a spotlight. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you for, and I'll share more later on sharing your family story with us and sharing your family story with the world. Um, I have a few questions that I'd love to ask you about the book. I read it, I studied it, and I'm grateful to have read it. And then, time permitting, we'll open the floor to anyone else who'd like to ask you a question as well. Um, you ended your conversation with us talking about memory and suppression. Um, I'd love for you to share more, if you could, um, about how you feel about your family suppressing the side of its story. You described the story very well, but how you interact with that suppression now, as you study this and share it with the world. How do you feel about your family suppressing the side of who you are?
I feel puzzled by it, I think, in some ways, especially when I think of my family. As I say, the people I think of were the two I was closest to, my mother and my grandmother, because I was so close to them. My mother was brutally honest. I mean, we used to joke about how she was one of these people who, if she went to the store with 25 cents of yours, she'd chase you all over to get back that quarter. And she was just so honest about everything. She was a very ethical person. So the fact that she never talked about this, I think, must covers the trauma that she must have felt. But I don't know how much she knew about the details of. I do know she went back to Hungary. She saw some of the Hungarian relatives who were still alive when she and my father went back. They sent money to them.
Mm,
But I'm puzzled by the fact that she was just never able to talk to me, and I was so close to her.
right. Why do you think she did that?
Again, I can only speculate, and I think it must have been trauma. She was adamantly anti-clerical. I mean, she really said, "I'm an atheist." My
Mm.
father would say he was an agnostic. He had a brother who was actually a Presbyterian missionary. I lived with that brother in Iran for a year when I was in high school.
That did make it into the book. That's
Uh,
fantastic.
that's another story.
Okay.
I learned a lot in that year. Um, but I think some of that feeling about religion is also is very likely to be tied up in the war.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that has had an impact on me is that although I'm still a very secular person, that's just the way I was raised, but nevertheless, I work very closely with Jewish organizations. My work is with immigrants and refugees. I work with an organization here in Brooklyn that grew out of Congregation Beth Elohim, a local
Yeah,
synagogue, and
yeah, definitely.
um, I so I'd say that Jewish values are something that resonate with me. And many Jewish values resonate with me. Certainly welcoming the stranger, uh, revering education, and so forth.
Yeah. Um, one of the things I was so fascinated by your grandfather's life is uh, uh, I mean he was everywhere and did everything. Uh, I don't want to retell everything that you've shared with us today, but given your study of his life, do you see any through lines? Is there anything consistent from his childhood in Hungary to some 92 years later?
Yes, I think, well, I don't talk a lot in the book about the fact that he was a poet and he defined himself as a poet. He wrote a lot of poetry in Hungarian in particular. He
I
was a
should also say he didn't go into all that much detail about his children's books, but there's a poetry to his book.
yes.
I mean that was one of my favorite parts of reading the book is reading excerpts from I mean clearly he's a prize-winning author.
And I have a cousin, Wendy Brown, who is an important political philosopher, and she wrote an interpretation that I included in the book, a political interpretation of his children's books, which I found very interesting. So the through line for me was he was an intellectual, he was a charming man. And Wendy knew him much better because she lived and still, well, she's from the West Coast and they were close and not estranged the way my family was. Um, and she said when he walked into a room, everyone stopped talking. He was just had a magnetism and a charm and a poetic demeanor that was true of him his whole life. And he was interested in so many things, and he was accomplished at so many things. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And he was like Zelig, he was, if you remember that Woody Allen story, he was in so many very significant places at different times in American and European history.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm wondering, given all the places that he lived, many of which were difficult, obviously, for someone who was Jewish, how do you think his life and career, start with career. How do you think his career would have been different if he weren't Jewish?
I think he might not have been hired by the OSS.
Oh, no kidding.
Because they needed people who spoke Serbo-Croatian and
Right.
German and Italian. And in fact, I found a letter or something in the files that suggested that even though he had relatives, his sister and his mother and so on, in fascist Hungary and was Jewish, that they needed someone like him because of his language ability. And there were other Jews in the OSS who were hired for exactly that reason. Their knowledge of fascist occupied countries and the language ability that others didn't have. So on the other hand, I think that I have found a few quite specific examples of discrimination and some negative things that were even written in reports about him as a Jew that demonstrate that there was, of course, anti-Semitism in the OSS as there was throughout the US government.
Right. I mean, it's just fascinating to learn about someone of Hungarian heritage and Jewish heritage also heading a field office
Yes.
for the Allied forces for Britain. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I have a page of questions I'd love to ask you, but I know that there are participants on this call who have questions as well. One of them was written in our chat. Joan, I'll read this on your behalf. How did your grandfather manage to cross the Atlantic so often during World War II, given the danger of submarines?
Um, I have the ship manifest or the ship, the documents that showed what ships he took, and I guess he was an American citizen early on, and
Mhm.
so as an American citizen, he was able to take these ships, and I don't know. I can't answer beyond that. I just have records of the ships he took going from, as I say, the US and Argentina and back to the US, and certainly back and forth from Europe but now he spent a lot of World War II in Europe.
Right.
He was for a time in Istanbul, he was in the London office of the OSS, and he was but he started out in Washington. Well, started out in New York and then with the OSS and then in Washington. And he did go back and forth, and I have some records of that, but I don't know anything more than this about it.
It was a terrifying time.
Yes.
Um, I'm going to open up the floor to maybe another question or two. Not, I certainly have. Okay. So one of the things, Katherine, that we spoke about before this conversation is the role that memory plays as Jews and in Jewish tradition. Um, and one of the things that we spoke about is, or that you spoke about in your book, is this idea of selective storytelling, that the stories we tell about our lives are by nature selective and highly selective, I think is the term that you use. Um, uh, what what do you hope you describe your grandmother, your mother? What do you hope your kids take from this book? What do you hope your grandkids take from the story that you've uncovered?
Well, I think my grandchildren are 2 and 4, so but my daughters have already taken some of what I hope for, which is just knowledge of our family history. And um, I ended up marrying an Iranian. We're not married now, but they are little United Nations
Mm.
children because my daughters, because they're Iranian American, Jewish, uh,
Unbelievable.
Hungarian,
Wow.
Argentinian, you name it. Uh, and so I think this reinforces it. And one thing my older daughter said to me was because her being half Iranian American has been a prominent part of her life growing up. And she said it was fascinating to her to think that I'm half Hungarian and that was as important to me growing up, or excuse me, that is as significant as her ancestry is to her. And yet one thing is, of course, if your surname is a paternal surname, my father was Irish German, and I'm just 25% Irish, 25% German. But I think before I knew this history, I identified perhaps more with the Irish side, and now much more with the Hungarian side. So I hope my children uh, have that as well.
Thank you for sharing your family's history with us, and for, in a way, sharing the history of the Jewish people, the Hungarian Jewish story, with our community and with our people. There is uh, this idea in Jewish tradition that we are the stories that we tell, and we become the stories that we tell. And by you sharing your grandfather's story with us, you have opened us, you certainly me, to a wider array of what the Jewish story can be, could be, both for the better and unfortunately for the worse moving forward. But the love that you have given your family and especially your daughters, your grandchildren, and future generations is a gift that you've shared with us today. So thank you very much for joining, for being a part of our conversation, our community today. And as Ruth said, Shabbat Shalom.